I remember the first knock. It was quiet, deliberate, almost polite. I didn't recognize her at first. She was impossibly poised, the kind of woman people watched in boardrooms, not in my hallway. She said without preamble, "I've come to claim what I owed 20 years ago." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but the weight in her eyes froze me. My daughter was in the next room. The day was ordinary, and yet everything shifted. I realized then that someone had been keeping records, memories, debts I didn't even know existed. And in that instant I understood. I had been underestimated, overlooked, and lied to. All the quiet truths were about to surface, whether I was ready or not. Morning comes quietly, almost unnoticed. I wake to the faint hum of the heater and the soft creak of the floorboards as my daughter moves in her room. I make coffee before I even think about her. It's not a ritual, just a way to anchor myself. The kettle whistles and I stand by the window watching the street below. Cars pass, neighbors walk dogs, the same patterns every day. It feels safe, ordinary, predictable. I prepare breakfast without hurry. Eggs, toast, her favorite orange juice. She wanders in, hair in a tangle, eyes still heavy with sleep. We sit together at the small kitchen table and she talks about school as I nod, half listening, letting her words fill the quiet. I know these moments are fleeting. She won't sit with me like this for long. I cherish the stillness, the trust implicit in her presence. Work follows. I run a modest consultancy, managing spreadsheets and client emails from my home office. My reputation is built quietly, slowly. I have clients who rely on me, colleagues who respect me. No one questions my competence, but I rarely mention my personal life. It's a boundary I've learned to protect. People are polite. They trust me professionally. And in my home, trust is everything. Evenings are predictable too. Dinner, homework, small talks about nothing, and then reading in the living room while she drifts to sleep. I notice details. The way her pencil hovers over her workbook, how her favorite mug has a tiny chip on the rim, the faint scratch on the floor by the doorway. These are the things that matter to me. These are proofs that I am present, that my care is tangible. I have friends, old colleagues, neighbors who wave as they pass, people who call occasionally to check in. I believe in the honesty of these gestures. I believe in them because I have to, otherwise the world would feel impossibly brittle. At night, I sit alone in the living room looking at the darkened kitchen. I listen to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the settling house. I feel quiet pride in the life I've built, simple, contained, trustworthy. But there is always a shadow at the edge of this comfort, faint and easily dismissed, a reminder that normalcy is fragile, and trust, even the most carefully given, can be tested in ways you never anticipate. The first subtle shift came in small gestures I almost didn't notice. A friend who usually returned calls promptly left messages unanswered for days. A neighbor glanced past me in a way that felt deliberate but easily explained. I told myself it was nothing. People get busy, distractions happen, but a quiet unease settled in my chest. It wasn't sharp, just persistent, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. One afternoon, I picked up my daughter from school and noticed a car parked too long near the entrance, engine off, windows dark. It could have been anyone. I told her to hurry and we walked faster. Later, when I mentioned it to a colleague, they brushed it off as coincidence. Their certainty should have been comforting. Instead, it made me doubt my own instincts. Even at home, there were small disruptions. Items misplaced, her shoes in the kitchen, a notebook on the couch that I could have sworn I'd left on the desk. I found myself double-checking doors, locks, and files. Every little inconsistency gnawed at me, though I kept my voice calm, my face neutral. I didn't want to make her or anyone else anxious over something I couldn't yet define. Work, too, started feeling off. Emails arrived with vague urgency, instructions that didn't match previous agreements. Meetings that were supposed to be routine ended with curt questions I didn't understand. No one explained, no one apologized. I recorded notes carefully, but a lingering sense of being slightly manipulated, tested, or watched stayed with me. I didn't say anything, not yet. At night I noticed patterns I couldn't ignore, calls that came when I was alone, texts that seemed irrelevant but persistent. I reviewed my day in quiet detail, replaying interactions, checking for missteps I hadn't noticed. I felt tired but alert. Something was not right, yet nothing concrete had happened. I began keeping small mental logs. I observed without accusation, waiting for clarity. I noticed when people avoided my eyes, when a tone shifted just slightly, when explanations felt rehearsed. It was subtle. It was nothing. And yet it pressed in, a quiet tension that made ordinary life heavier. I told myself to trust the calm I had built, but a part of me, the part that notices shadows in corners, felt the first real tremor of a world about to change. It started with inconsistencies I could no longer dismiss. A conversation that didn't match a previous one. An email from a client with details I had never discussed. I caught myself rereading messages, retracing calls, trying to find where I had misremembered, but the gaps were real. They weren't mistakes I had made. They were deliberate, and I knew it before I even wanted to admit it. One evening I noticed my daughter's favorite mug, tiny chip on the rim exactly where I remembered, but the water I poured came from a cup I didn't recognize. I asked her about it quietly. She shrugged, distracted, uninterested. It was a small thing, but I felt the shift. Something unseen had moved in our space, a presence I could not identify. At work, patterns became harder to ignore. Files were opened before I authorized them. Reports appeared with edits I hadn't made. Colleagues were polite but unusually precise, careful not to confirm or deny anything. I could feel the watchful eyes, the measured distance. And when I asked a direct question, the answer came in vague reassurances, words that sounded like truth but carried the weight of evasion. Then came the calls from people I barely knew, messages referring to decisions I didn't make, appointments I didn't schedule. My instincts screamed at me, but I kept my voice even, measured. Panic is a luxury I could not afford. I documented everything, noting the times, the details, the discrepancies. Each one seemed minor, almost accidental, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. A neighbor, someone I had trusted, made an offhand remark that didn't match what I knew of my own schedule. My heart sank, a cold weight settling across my chest. It wasn't malice exactly, it was exposure. The people I had assumed were ordinary and reliable were not what I thought. And the realization came quietly, like the slow drip of water eroding stone. The world I had trusted, the life I had built, was not entirely mine. By the end of the week I was walking through familiar rooms with a sense of unfamiliarity. Small shadows caught my attention, a door left ajar, a note that seemed misplaced. I felt under observation, even in my own home. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, yet the unease was undeniable. Trust, once solid and certain, now felt fragile. And I understood with a clarity that was frightening in its quietness that someone had already begun to cross the line I had never thought would be crossed. I began to speak up quietly, carefully, hoping to clarify what I was seeing. But the responses I received were almost worse than the uncertainty itself. Colleagues smiled, politely nodded, and said I must be mistaken. "You're imagining things," one said with that practiced calm that makes doubts stick in your own mind. Another suggested I was overworked, letting fatigue distort reality. Each dismissal was subtle, measured, and entirely believable, yet each one chipped away at my confidence, leaving a hollow ache where certainty had been. At home, the feeling followed me like a shadow. When I mentioned the misplaced items, my daughter looked confused, then frustrated. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," she said. Even her voice, gentle yet firm, implied that I was wrong to notice, wrong to question. The small sanctuary of our home began to feel less safe, less ours. My observations, once reassuring, were now suspect, even to me. The more I insisted on clarity, the more I was met with patient, quiet invalidation. Emails were labeled miscommunications, when I knew they were deliberate. Minor incidents were reframed as mistakes I had caused. The world seemed to conspire against my own perception. I began to record conversations, take screenshots, leave written notes for myself, small anchors against the tide of doubt. Even friends, people I had trusted, began to hesitate. Their words were careful, their gestures restrained. They didn't outright lie, but they chose neutrality over confirmation. It was as if acknowledging my suspicion might force them to take sides, and none of them wanted to. I could feel the isolation closing in, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, patient, and unrelenting. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I would sit in the living room, staring at the darkened kitchen, tracing the edges of my life. Every misplaced item, every vague message, every subtle evasion replayed in my mind. I asked myself if I had missed something, misread signs, misremembered. But the unease never went away. The gaslighting was not loud, it was ordinary. It was so seamless that I had to remind myself that I had noticed before, that I had seen clearly. And yet, even as doubt crept in, a quiet certainty persisted underneath. Someone was manipulating what I could see, what I could trust, and what I could feel. The world was shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and I understood in the stillness that my trust was being weaponized. The betrayal was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. The first concrete evidence came in a form I couldn't ignore. A file misplaced in my office folder, a copy of an email chain I had never received before, its contents carefully phrased but unmistakably referencing decisions I hadn't made. My hands trembled slightly as I read it, but I kept my voice calm when I mentioned it to a colleague. They brushed it off at first, citing overlapping responsibilities, yet their hesitation, the way they avoided my eyes, told me something was wrong. Later, a friend, someone I had trusted for years, called quietly in the evening. Their voice was low, cautious. They didn't volunteer the information, but when I asked directly, they confirmed fragments I had suspected. It wasn't the whole truth, not yet, but it was enough. Enough to feel the walls of certainty crumbling, enough to realize that the things I had dismissed as coincidences were deliberate, and that the betrayal was more intricate than I had imagined. I started finding small, undeniable proofs scattered around. A receipt with my name on it for an appointment I hadn't scheduled, messages that had been deleted but were partially retrievable, notes left by someone else in places only I would notice. Each discovery was like lifting a corner of a curtain, revealing shadows behind the familiar shapes of my life. The betrayal wasn't an abstract threat anymore. It had a shape. It had weight. Even my daughter noticed the tension. She asked questions, innocent but precise, about small things she had seen. I tried to answer without overreacting, but the anxiety in her voice mirrored my own. I realized that this exposure wasn't only about me anymore. It had started touching her, the quiet center of my life. Protecting her became part of the calculus, what I could investigate, what I could confront, what I could endure without fracturing her sense of safety. I began cataloging everything meticulously. Every discrepancy, every hint, every half-truth was logged. I didn't trust anyone fully, not yet. And yet the pieces were forming a mosaic I couldn't ignore. The patterns were there for anyone willing to see, yet those around me, some complicit, some oblivious, continued to pretend everything was normal. The silence of their compliance was almost louder than the betrayals themselves. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture: the manipulation, the misdirection, the quiet control that had been exercised over me. Partial exposure was cruel in its own way. It gave me just enough certainty to feel violated, but not enough to act without consequence. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into a truth I could no longer avoid. And in that space, heavy and quiet, I understood something else. The world I had built, the trust I had offered, had been carefully eroded, layer by layer, by someone who knew exactly how to hide behind the ordinary. The pace of intrusion accelerated. Subtle hints had become undeniable actions. Files I had thought private were accessed before I even knew they existed. Calls came from numbers I didn't recognize, asking questions I hadn't authorized. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't limited to a single thread of my life. It was a network, a system operating just beyond my control. I was trapped in a web I hadn't even known was being spun. At work, colleagues who had seemed distant now edged away entirely. Requests were rerouted, instructions ignored, opportunities withheld. I tried to speak up calmly, factually, presenting the evidence I had gathered. The responses were polite but immovable. "These things happen," they said. "There must be a reason we didn't loop you in." No one offered clarity, no one offered accountability. It was as if the system itself, the structure I had trusted, was complicit, or at least indifferent. At home, the quiet disruptions intensified. Doors left open, objects subtly rearranged, notes that weren't mine appearing in my own handwriting, almost invisible signs of someone testing the boundaries of my space. I would find myself pausing, listening to the faintest creak, noticing the tiniest detail. It was exhausting, a constant tension, a low hum of danger beneath the ordinary. Even my daughter's routines were subtly altered, small changes that hinted someone else was moving around us when we weren't looking. I began to confront the person I suspected. Each attempt was met with calm deflection, measured denial. There was no explosion, no anger in the responses, just a quiet insistence that I was mistaken, that my perception was flawed. And yet the proof I had collected could not be denied. Emails, receipts, altered schedules, witnesses who had seen fragments of the truth. I started to notice patterns in the manipulation: timing, placement, phrasing, all deliberate, all designed to make me doubt myself while ensuring control remained firmly in their hands. Friends and neighbors became cautious. Some avoided me as if proximity might force them into complicity. Others offered vague reassurances that did nothing to alleviate the unease. The world I had trusted, the people, the structures, the very fabric of daily life, was now unreliable. And as the scope of the betrayal expanded, I felt the quiet power of the other side pressing in. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent, but it was relentless. Every day I mapped the moves, tried to anticipate the next intrusion, the next manipulation. The stakes were rising faster than I could adjust. The boundaries I had assumed were safe, home, work, friends, routines, were porous. And through it all I realized, the betrayal had become systemic. It was no longer a single act of deception. It had grown into a network of quiet power, and I was caught in it, forced to respond with caution, observation, and patience. My life, once ordinary and predictable, was now defined by the shadow of someone else's calculated control. The weight of it settled on me like a slow, relentless pressure. Every inconsistency, every manipulation, every evasive answer I had documented pressed in from every angle. I felt it most at night, when the house was quiet, when my daughter slept, and the normal rhythms of life paused. I would sit in the living room, the dim light from the street filtering through the blinds, and count the betrayals in my head like a ledger I couldn't close. I realized then that denial was no longer an option. I had tried for weeks to rationalize, to excuse, to believe that there must be some explanation that preserved my sense of order. But the truth was unyielding. The trust I had offered freely, the quiet faith in my home, my work, my relationships had been systematically eroded. And the realization carried a cost heavier than I had anticipated. I began noticing the toll on my body. Sleepless nights, muscles tense even in moments of stillness, the faint tremor in my hands as I opened files or reread emails. My mind, once a place of clarity and quiet observation, had become a battlefield. Every thought turned over potential threats, every memory dissected for inconsistencies, every interaction measured for hidden meaning. The betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute, and I could feel it consuming the life I had built around ordinary routines. Even my daughter sensed it. She asked questions in passing, her voice cautious, careful, almost accusatory. I answered as best I could, keeping the tone neutral, masking the turmoil, but I felt the strain in our connection. The betrayal had begun to seep into every corner of my life, infecting the spaces I had assumed were safe. My world, once small and reliable, had expanded into a field of constant vigilance, and I was losing the energy to sustain it. I remember the moment I finally acknowledged it fully. Sitting at my desk, reviewing the pattern of intrusion and manipulation, the full scope of the deception became undeniable. It was no longer a series of coincidences or minor oversights. It was deliberate, structured, and enduring. The person responsible had not only crossed boundaries, they had rewritten them, reshaped the rules of what I could trust and who I could rely upon. In that moment I felt a quiet collapse. Not a scream, not a dramatic breakdown, just the recognition that the life I had assumed was mine had been partially stolen. The betrayal had a name, a pattern, and an authority I could not challenge directly without consequence. And yet beneath the despair, a slow, heavy clarity emerged. I understood the truth, the limits of control, and the quiet, immutable cost of being seen, underestimated, and manipulated for so long. The truth, once partially hidden, began to assert itself in ways that could no longer be ignored. Evidence I had gathered, notes I had meticulously recorded, and the fragments I had pieced together coalesced into a pattern that was undeniable. Others could no longer dismiss it, and the betrayer, confronted with the quiet weight of reality, could no longer deny it either. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation in the hallway, no violent revelation. The consequences unfolded in muted tones and careful gestures. Files were corrected, appointments acknowledged, truths admitted in the smallest, most deliberate ways. The betrayer's power, once subtle but pervasive, lost its invisibility. It did not vanish entirely, but its reach had been exposed, catalogued, and for the first time constrained. Colleagues who had previously avoided the issue now spoke with measured clarity. Policies and protocols that had allowed manipulation to take hold were acknowledged and adjusted. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the quiet recognition that what had been hidden was no longer invisible. The system that had enabled the betrayal began to respond, slowly, hesitantly, but with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. At home, the shift was more subtle but no less significant. The small disruptions, the misplaced items, the shadows in familiar rooms, all of them began to diminish. My daughter noticed the calm first, though she did not speak of it. We moved through our routines with a quiet certainty I had thought lost, a fragile peace restored not by celebration but by recognition. The balance of control once tilted had been quietly re-established. I watched the betrayer navigate these consequences with the same poise they had exercised in the initial deception. There was no visible humiliation, no loud remorse, only the slow, inevitable acknowledgement that the truth was now a permanent presence, shaping their choices and movements. I did not feel satisfaction. There was no triumph. The damage had been done, the trust fractured, and the emotional cost was ours to carry. And yet there was clarity. The world, though changed, was comprehensible again. I could see the boundaries, the limitations, and the realignment of quiet power. The betrayal had consequences, small but tangible, and in that recognition there was a measure of resolution. Not relief, not celebration, but the kind of calm that comes from knowing what is real and what has been irrevocably exposed. The house is still. My daughter sleeps, her breathing steady, and I sit in the living room, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight through the blinds. The betrayals, the manipulations, the unseen calculations, they are all laid bare now. Nothing is hidden, nothing is unaccounted for. The world feels heavier, quieter, more honest in its weight. I do not feel triumph. There is no celebration. The betrayer has faced the consequences, yes, but the cost remains with me, with the life we tried to protect. My trust has been fractured, my vigilance sharpened, and my perspective forever altered. Yet there is calm. The clarity of truth, even when painful, allows the day to continue. Meals are made, routines are observed, laughter returns in small doses. We live within the aftermath, not above it. And in that quiet, heavy space, I finally understand that some truths do not come with vindication. They come with acceptance, endurance, and the unspoken weight of having seen the world as it really is.